"Sorry, I'm in a wheelchair," Sloane Kingsley said, and the restaurant staff looked at her the way they look at an inconvenience no one planned for. Evan Rourke did not leave. He moved the spare chair from the table, placed the VIP placard face down on the floor, and told the manager to open the main entrance, not the service corridor they had pointed her toward. When the manager laughed and told a single father in a construction jacket not to cause a scene, Evan made one call. 10 minutes later, the hotel owner arrived pale-faced, and Sloane understood this night had never been a coincidence. If you want to watch the arrogant finally lower their heads, stay with this story. The reversal no one sees coming is already in motion. The boardroom on the 14th floor of Kingsley Crown Hotel's corporate headquarters had been redesigned twice in the last decade, and both times the contractor had installed a raised presentation platform at the far end without a single accommodation for a wheelchair. Sloane Kingsley had noticed this the first time she attended a meeting there after her accident 4 years ago, and she had noticed it every meeting since, and she had said nothing about it because she had learned, in the way that people who live in bodies the world was not built for learn many things, that pointing it out would cost her more than absorbing it herself. The morning of the merger presentation, a deal that would bring a 9-figure investment into Kingsley Crown Hotels from a European private equity group. She arrived early to position herself near the front, organized her materials with the precision she applied to every quarterly report, and waited while the room filled with board members who directed their greetings to the man standing beside her rather than to her. Preston Kingsley, her cousin and the company's chief operating officer, entered last, pressed his hand to the shoulder of every man in the room, and took his seat at the head of the table without looking at her. Sloane presented the expansion framework she had been developing for 7 months, market projections, occupancy modeling, the phased renovation schedule that would bring all 18 properties into compliance with updated accessibility standards while holding operational disruption below 4%. It was a thorough document built on data she had gathered personally, and she had barely finished the third slide when a board member named Gerald Forsyth interrupted to observe that the numbers in her renovation column seemed higher than what the company had budgeted for that kind of upgrade. The phrase was one of those constructions that meant precisely what the speaker intended while remaining technically deniable, and Sloane recognized it without showing that she recognized it, and she explained the return on investment model she had built, showing that accessible properties achieved higher guest satisfaction scores and lower turnover in event bookings, and she presented it cleanly, without the defensive energy that would have confirmed the assumption behind the question. Preston turned a pen over in his fingers and said nothing. After the presentation, when most of the room had moved toward the coffee service, Preston approached Sloane with the particular smoothness of a man delivering bad news in the language of courtesy. He told her the board had concerns. Not about the numbers, he was careful to add, but about optics. The upcoming merger would require extensive public attention, investor dinners, and media appearances, and some members felt that Sloane's situation, he used the word with the measured neutrality of a diplomat, had become a narrative that overshadowed the company's story. He said that a CEO with a fuller public profile would give shareholders greater confidence, and he said it without saying she was a liability, which made it worse than if he had. He mentioned that Malara Foss, the family's public relations director, had suggested a curated introduction to someone appropriate. A quiet evening, handled discreetly, the kind of arrangement that generated the right kind of coverage without requiring explanation. Sloane understood within the first 12 words what Preston was actually proposing. He was not suggesting she find companionship. He was suggesting she allow herself to be displayed in a situation designed to suggest normalcy a performance of a life that would reassure people who were uncomfortable with the reality of hers. She told him she would think about it. He told her Mallory had already identified someone, and the reservation was made. The man's name was Evan Rourke, described as a single father who worked in property maintenance and construction. Preston used that description with a particular emphasis that was meant to communicate the limitation of the match, as though the only man Sloane could reasonably expect to attract was one who fixed things for a living. As she left the boardroom, she heard two board members behind her placing a wager on how many minutes into the evening Evan Rourke would find an excuse to leave. That evening, Mallory Voss sent a message from her personal phone to an unlisted number, and the message read, "She has agreed to attend. Make sure the restaurant follows the arrangement exactly." Blackthorn Grand occupied a full city block in the financial district and had been considered one of the most prestigious addresses in the city for nearly 40 years. The kind of establishment that maintained its reputation not through warmth, but through the implication that being admitted was itself a distinction. Sloane arrived at 6:58, 2 minutes before the reservation, because arriving early gave her time to assess a space before anyone decided to make her accommodation their problem. The main entrance, wide glass-paneled doors opening onto a marble foyer she had photographed for the company's competitor analysis file, was flanked by two large decorative planters that had been moved since the last time she had passed the building, positioned at the exact width that blocked the automatic door sensor from detecting a wheelchair at the threshold, and the result was elegant enough to appear accidental. A front desk attendant directed her without hesitation toward a secondary entrance along the east wall, which she followed to discover it accessed a loading corridor used for food deliveries and linen service, with a key-coded door that required her to wait while someone came to open it. The manager who appeared was Dana Whitlock, a woman in her mid-40s who wore the specific expression of someone exercising authority they enjoy more than they should, and who told Sloane with brisk, practiced professionalism that the main entrance was currently reserved for VIP guests, and that the service corridor would allow her to reach the dining room without disrupting the experience. Sloane asked whether she was not a guest. Dana said that the configuration was temporary and for everyone's benefit. A pair of diners passing the corridor entrance glanced over, and one of them raised a phone. Sloane entered through the service corridor. The dining room was exactly as the photographs showed. High ceilings, low lighting, tables arranged with the studied asymmetry that suggested spontaneous elegance. The table assigned to her reservation had a large upholstered armchair positioned at the exact place a wheelchair would need to occupy, moved from elsewhere to fill the space, so that when she arrived, it would be either already claimed or requiring a production to remove. And a server appeared and told her the chair was part of the table's arrangement, and when Sloane asked for it to be moved, the server looked over her shoulder before responding, as though checking whether someone of sufficient authority had approved the inconvenience. The movement created a sight line across the dining room, and 3 tables of guests turned to observe. Evan Rourke arrived at 7 o'clock in a jacket that bore the faint crease of something folded over a truck seat because he had come directly from a site walk at a renovation project 4 blocks away and had not had time to go home. Dana Whitlock intercepted him at the entrance, looked at his clothes, and told him the kitchen staff entrance was on the south side of the building. Evan gave the name on the reservation. Dana's expression shifted from dismissal to something that resembled amusement at a situation confirming a prior assumption, and she said that the restaurant was welcoming all kinds of guests that evening and guided him to the table with the quality of attention reserved for things that need to be managed. Sloane saw him approach and felt the familiar tightening in her chest that preceded the moment she had come to expect, the pause, the calculation, the search for an acceptable exit, and she looked at the tablecloth and said at first, "Sorry, I'm in a wheelchair. The service did not tell you." She understood if this changed things. Evan did not pause. He did not look down at the wheelchair. He looked at her face and said, quietly and without theatrical kindness, why would she apologize for arriving on time? He moved the oversized armchair from the table with one arm, creating natural space on his side as well as hers, and sat down as though the evening had begun in exactly the way it was supposed to. Dana appeared and told him the chair placement was intentional. Evan looked at the room, noticed the camera mounted near a decorative column angled precisely at their table, and set the VIP placard that had been standing on the table face down on the seat of the armchair he had moved, and he said, clearly enough to be heard at the nearest two tables, "If this section cannot accommodate her, then this section is the one that falls below standard." Dana Whitlock smiled in the particular way of someone who has decided that the person in front of them is not worth changing course for. And she told Evan it was very kind of a single father from a construction background to try to make an impression, but that the Blackthorn Grand maintained a certain standard and the evening would proceed more smoothly if he returned the chair and allowed her staff to manage guest arrangements. And she added she could have security escort him through the service entrance as well, if he found the main door too convenient. Sloane had already begun to turn her chair, preparing to absorb another evening that confirmed what too many evenings had confirmed, and she was framing the words she would use to tell Evan he did not have to do this, when Evan asked her directly and without performing the question for anyone else's benefit whether she wanted to leave or whether she wanted to be admitted through the entrance she had every right to use. The question was careful and real. He was not deciding for her. He was asking. Sloane said she wanted the main entrance opened the way it would be opened for any other guest. Evan took out his phone. He did not make a speech or raise his voice or explain himself to Dana, who was already signaling to a security guard. He dialed a number, spoke for less than 40 seconds, and ended the call. Dana told him that whatever he thought he was accomplishing was about to become embarrassing for a man in his position. 8 minutes passed. Then the doors to the private dining corridor opened, and Malcolm Blackthorn came through them. A man of 58 in a dinner jacket who had built his family's brand on the premise that the Blackthorn name needed no defense, and his face, when he saw Evan Rourke, was the face of a man who had just discovered a structural flaw in something he believed to be solid. Evan told Malcolm, in the same tone he would use to describe a load-bearing beam inspection, that Rourke Urban Holdings owned the land parcel and the foundational structural systems beneath the building they were currently standing in, and that Blackthorn Grand operated under a long-term lease agreement scheduled for renewal in 90 days, and that the lease contained a safety compliance clause which specifically prohibited the obstruction of emergency access systems. A clause that covered the main entrance sensor array and the service lift mechanism, both of which were currently blocked or non-functional. He noted that the obstruction constituted a material breach, and he would be requesting an immediate third-party safety inspection and the temporary isolation of non-compliant areas pending correction. He said this without looking at Dana, without looking at the guests who had fallen quiet, and without looking at Sloane, because he was saying it not to impress her, but because it was true and because it was the correct action. Malcolm Blackthorn turned to Dana and told her to have the main entrance cleared, the planters returned to their original positions, and the service lift tested and confirmed operational before the end of the evening. Dana's expression traveled through several distinct phases: disbelief, reassessment, and finally the particular blankness of someone who has understood that the person she dismissed had been holding a card she could not match. The guests who had watched Sloane navigate the service entrance watched her cross the main foyer without a word and Evan did not stride ahead or position himself as escort. He walked beside her at the pace she chose, and the difference between being led and being accompanied was not lost on either of them. When Malcolm brought them personally to the garden terrace, Evan asked Sloane where she would like to sit. She chose the glass-enclosed corridor on the ground floor, because it was the one area of the building where no one had looked at her with anything yet, and she could see the city through the walls without performing gratitude for being permitted into the room. Before leaving them, Malcolm handed Evan a printed copy of an internal email that his assistant had located in the management system. The email had been sent to Dana Whitlock's work account 3 days before the reservation, and it said in plain language, "Ensure Miss Kingsley is directed to the service entrance. The camera will handle the rest." The garden terrace of the Blackthorn Grand was a long, glass-enclosed corridor of tables facing a courtyard of boxwood and stone, and at 8 o'clock on a weekday it held only 2 other parties, neither of whom looked at them after the first moment, and the quality of the silence there was different from the silence of the dining room. It was the silence of a space that simply existed rather than one performing itself. Sloane read the email twice before she set it down, and Evan watched her face while she read it, not to assess her reaction but because her face was the honest record of a person understanding something large that had been invisible to everyone else who knew it. She asked him why he had not told the manager immediately who he was. Evan said that power used as a first response teaches the wrong people the wrong lesson. It tells them only that they chose the wrong target, not that they were wrong. She asked why he had agreed to the introduction at all. Knowing his company's relationship with Kingsley Crown Properties, and he said the matchmaking contact had given his name through someone he trusted, and he had known nothing about the internal politics until he arrived and recognized the architecture of a setup. He told her about Avery briefly. 16 years old, a junior in high school, organized and occasionally demanding in the cheerful way of a person who has managed a single parent's household schedule since she was 12. His phone registered a message during the meal and he showed it to her. Avery asking whether he had remembered to pick up the breakfast items she had added to the refrigerator list. Evan responded with a thumbs up that he later admitted was a bluff. The message was the smallest possible window into a life, and it was enough to show Sloane something she had not seen in any of the other evenings she had spent across from men who described their children as evidence of their depth. He asked her about her work without the particular brand of surprise some people deployed when they learned she ran a company, and he asked specific questions about the expansion model she had mentioned in passing, and she found herself answering with candor rather than calculation. When she brought up the accident, she was the one who raised it, not because she owed him the story, but because the evening had arrived at the kind of ease where omitting it felt more like strategy than privacy. He listened. He did not say she was an inspiration. He did not say she was remarkable for continuing. He said that a building designed to require an apology from the person entering it had been built incorrectly, and that the error was architectural rather than personal. It was the first time anyone had located the problem outside of her. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprises a person into sound rather than the polished version she deployed in professional settings, and Evan smiled at the table in front of him because the laugh was not for him, but he was glad it was there. He had left the sender's name on the email partially obscured because the address had been routed through an encryption service, but the style of the communication, the controlled language, the instruction to let the camera handle the outcome, matched the methods Sloane had watched Mallory Voss apply to 3 previous crises. Mallory had a particular way of writing operational instructions that sounded like event logistics even when they were something else, and Sloane recognized the signature of it immediately. Evan pointed to the small camera mounted near the column at the dining room entrance, and to the man near the west door holding his phone at an angle inconsistent with casual use. Sloane saw the infrastructure of it clearly, and the understanding arrived not as a surprise but as confirmation of something she had half known since Mallory presented the introduction as spontaneous. Evan offered to send her the full documentation from the evening. The email, the camera footage Malcolm had confirmed, the entrance obstruction records. He asked nothing in return, and she studied him because the logic required examination. A man who controlled the land beneath 3 of her most valuable properties had appeared at a blind date, had identified the setup within the first hour, and was now offering her material directly useful in an internal dispute she had not described in detail. Evan said, without defense, that he had not known which properties his company held ground leases on when he agreed to the evening, because Rourke Urban Holdings managed over 400 individual parcels and he did not carry the portfolio in his head. She believed him because the alternative required a patience and precision she had not encountered, combined in this particular, unhurried way. Evan looked once toward the camera and said, someone did not only want to embarrass her. Whoever arranged the evening needed the entire city to believe she was not strong enough to lead. The edited footage appeared across news and entertainment coverage the following morning. The version in circulation removed the sequence in which Dana Whitlock directed Sloane to the service corridor, removed the moment a guest raised a phone to record her, and began instead with Evan moving a chair, setting down a placard, and a hotel manager rushing across a dining room. Without context, the sequence looked like a wealthy woman had used her connection to a real estate figure to stage a confrontation at a competitor's hotel. One headline called it a power play. Another raised questions about conflicts of interest at the highest level of Kingsley Crown's leadership. Preston arrived at the emergency board session in a bespoke suit, and the composed expression of a man grieved by events he had nothing to do with, described the previous evening as a personal indiscretion that had become a public crisis, and said twice, so the room would hear it twice, that he was concerned about Sloane's judgment. A board member named Forsyth asked, with the speculative tone of a man testing language he had been given in advance, whether the company could afford a CEO whose personal life generated this kind of instability. Sloane presented the email. Preston looked at it with the attention of a man examining a document he had already seen and said that its provenance was unknown, that a real estate developer with financial interest in Kingsley Crown held both the means and motive to fabricate communications designed to drive a wedge between the CEO and her board, and that the question the room should be asking was not whether Sloane had been set up but why she had been alone at night in a hotel property with a man whose company held land rights over 3 of their most critical assets. The argument was constructed to be unfair in a way that could not be answered without reinforcing it, and the room received it the way rooms receive things that confirm what they were already inclining toward. The annual corporate dinner for Kingsley Crown Hotels was held that same evening, and Evan Rourke attended as the representative of Rourke Urban Holdings, which had submitted a structural upgrade proposal for the renovation program. He wore a dark suit without a tie and arrived without an assistant or security, and several guests assumed he was from the catering company. Preston identified him across the room and crossed to him with a glass of wine, and the social confidence of someone who had never seriously encountered a situation his family name could not resolve. He told Evan, in the pleasant tone of a remark meant to be overheard by the people nearby, that the evening was an occasion for the company's actual partners, and that Evan would probably find the service entrance easier to navigate than the main hall. Evan did not smile and did not respond and did not move. He picked up the glass of water in front of him and waited. During the presentation of the merger overview, A projected site map displayed the properties involved in the transaction, and Evan looked at it for approximately 30 seconds before he understood what he was seeing. 3 of the anchor properties, the Crown Metropolitan, the Kingsley Harbor, and the Pinnacle on 5th, were built on parcels his company controlled through ground lease agreements structured before the current board existed, and the renewal terms required active confirmation rather than automatic extension, and the merger documentation as presented to the investment group appeared to treat the properties as fully owned rather than lease-dependent. Evan found a quiet corner near the back of the room, photographed the projection, and sent it to his legal team with a single line of context. He waited until Preston had finished describing the exceptional position of the company's real estate holdings before he walked to the center of the room and asked, in the voice of a man who had been asking polite questions all evening and had now run out of politeness, whether Preston had confirmed with his land counsel that the ground lease renewals for all 3 anchor properties had been formally secured before the investment group was told the company owned them outright. Sloan and Evan met the following morning at a small office her legal team used for sensitive document reviews. Because she was not willing to enter the Kingsley Crown corporate offices while the board suspension was in effect, and he was not willing to conduct a meeting at a location Preston could access. They agreed without saying it aloud that whatever was developing between them personally would wait until the professional situation was resolved, because neither of them was the kind of person who made good decisions while standing inside the thing they were trying to evaluate clearly. Evan brought documentation showing that Rourke Urban Holdings had submitted renovation proposals to 6 Kingsley Crown properties over the previous 2 years. Proposals covering structural accessibility upgrades, emergency egress reconfiguration, and replacement of aging lift systems, and that each had been formally declined by the COO's office on the grounds that the work did not generate direct revenue, and that the declinations were dated within the same quarters in which the shareholder reports claimed the renovations were complete. They drove to the Crown Metropolitan after dark, entering through the maintenance level using Evan's access as ground leaseholder. The building showed them what the shareholder reports had not. The service lift designated as the primary accessible route to the banquet floor had a mechanism that had not been serviced in over 3 years, confirmed by the inspection tag on the interior panel and by Evan's own read of the hydraulic assembly. The emergency egress on the 7th floor was partially blocked by a storage configuration that would fail any compliance review. 4 rooms on the accessible floor were furnished in ways that reduced the turning radius below the required standard. The renovation budget had existed. The capital allocation was in the financial records Sloan had legal access to, but the money was not in the building. She located the transfer records within an hour. Approximately $3.2 million had been moved through a sequence of internal budget transfers into payments to an entity called Voss Strategic Advisory, structured as consulting fees for brand communications work, billed in quarterly installments over 22 months. Sloan had done enough corporate investigation to know that the name alone was not proof, but she also knew Mallory Voss well enough to recognize how Mallory structured her professional entities, the naming convention, the billing cycles, the choice of communications consulting as the category, because it was broad enough to resist easy audit and prestigious enough not to raise flags. She sat in a wheelchair in a hotel her family's name was on that she had defended at 8 board meetings in 4 years, and she understood that Preston had not only stolen from the company. He had built the theft inside the company's commitment to her. He had used her public positioning as the accessible CEO of an accessible brand as the camouflage behind which he concealed the evidence of his fraud. And every campaign that had shown her in these hotels, Every statement she had made about inclusive design had served as the cover story for the fact that the inclusion was fictional. She wanted to move, but she had watched Preston operate long enough to know that an unsecured exposure would give him time to destroy what remained and construct an alternative account. And she had watched Mallory work long enough to know that Mallory would blow Preston into an exit rather than stay and be exposed. The correct action was to allow Preston to continue believing he held the advantage until the moment he no longer did. She and Evan agreed to maintain the appearance of a rift. His side as a developer frustrated with the Kingsley board's resistance. Her side as a suspended CEO attempting to negotiate reinstatement. In a quiet moment near the floor-to-ceiling windows Evan had designed into this building's renovation permit 12 years earlier, Sloan asked why he spent so much of his company's resources on accessibility design in structures that were not legally required to prioritize it. He said a city that requires someone to ask permission before entering is not a luxury city. It is a city pretending to be one. Before they left, the building's security system logged an unauthorized login on Sloan's executive account from an IP address registered to a device she did not own, and the access log showed the account had been used to download the complete merger documentation package. Preston moved within 12 hours of the data breach, presenting the board with a security log that appeared to show Sloan's credentials accessing the merger files from a location consistent with where she and Evan had spent the previous evening. His argument was simple and designed to be, she had brought a real estate developer into a confidential situation. She had given him access, whether deliberately or through carelessness, to sensitive acquisition materials, and the board had a fiduciary responsibility to the investment group that superseded personal loyalty to a family member. The board voted 6-3 to suspend Sloan's operational authority for 72 hours pending formal review. Preston was named acting CEO by the same margin. The vote took 14 minutes. By 11 the following morning, he had scheduled the merger signing for the end of the week and communicated to the investment group that the internal review was a procedural formality that would not affect the timeline, because he understood that the window between her suspension and the signing was the only window that mattered, and that once the merger was completed, the evidence she had gathered would be addressing a transaction that no longer existed in its original form. Preston called Evan separately that afternoon, from a number that did not appear in his corporate directory, and he opened the conversation with the directness of a man negotiating from strength. He offered to purchase the ground lease rights for the 3 anchor properties at a premium of 30% above assessed value, structured as a clean transfer with no conditions attached. He described it as a reasonable offer for a maintenance contractor who had stumbled into a position he did not fully understand. He described Sloan as a woman whose isolation had made her attach meaning to a professional relationship, and he said it with the specificity of someone who had spent time developing the phrasing. Evan set his phone on the table and allowed the call to continue, because the recording had been running since Preston began the sentence about the maintenance contractor. When Evan declined, Preston said he would ensure that Avery understood her father had positioned himself as the protector of a disabled woman in order to gain leverage over her family's company. Evan remained still for a moment. That was longer than comfortable and shorter than dramatic, and he said that he appreciated Preston laying out his position so clearly. Preston had also arranged a public press briefing, framed as a statement of reassurance to the investment group, and he described Evan before the assembled journalists as a small contractor who had misrepresented his role and was now attempting to extract value from a family business during a period of transition. He used the phrase single father 3 times, each time with the inflection of a man describing a misfortune. When Evan walked to the front of the room after Preston finished, He did not bring a lawyer or a prepared statement. He brought a single sealed envelope, which he handed to Preston in front of the assembled press, and which contained a formal ground lease compliance violation notice and 60 pages of supporting documentation citing the 3 anchor properties, the obstructed safety systems, and the fraudulent renewal representations made to the investment group. Preston opened it, read the first page, and looked up at Evan with the expression of a man who believed he was watching a small fire and has just been told the building is gone. Evan said, in front of every journalist in the room, that Preston might own the name above the door, but he had just signed commitments on buildings standing on someone else's land. Sloane did not call Evan to congratulate him. She had been building her case in parallel because the outcome required both, the legal structure he held and the governance action she could initiate. And she had known since the morning after the camera was pointed at her table that if she waited for someone else's strategy to complete, she would spend the next board meeting describing what had been done for her rather than what she had done herself. She filed the extraordinary shareholder review request the morning after the press briefing, while Preston was occupied with investor calls generated by Evan's lease notice, and the request arrived on the board system while his attention was elsewhere. The request required a specific percentage of voting share support and a documented claim of material misrepresentation, both of which she now held. And she had the required signatures from allied shareholders by midnight. Evan had been gathering materials from Blackthorne Grand since the night of the dinner. Malcolm Blackthorne agreed to cooperate fully, partly because he was a reasonable man who had been used badly, and partly because the ground lease renewal conversation had clarified his incentives with considerable precision. Malcolm provided the original email instructing Dana Whitlock on the entrance obstruction, along with the payment receipt for the camera equipment installed in the dining room 4 days before the reservation, billed to a production company sharing a registered address with Voss Strategic Advisory. Preston had begun preparing Mallory as the designated responsible party, the contractor who had exceeded her instructions, the communications professional who had interpreted a strategy too literally, and his legal team sent Mallory a document suggesting she prepare a statement characterizing her role as that of an independent vendor who had made decisions without board authorization. She read it once and understood it completely. She was being handed the legal responsibility for a conspiracy she had executed on his instructions, and she was being given language designed to leave her no position from which to dispute the framing afterward. Mallory arrived at Sloane's apartment building at 7 in the morning with a drive containing 12 months of communications between herself and Preston. She did not ask forgiveness first. She sat across from Sloane and said she had done what she did because she believed in the hierarchy she had served and because she had been told the situation was about protecting the company, and she had believed it long enough to stop asking the questions that would have shown her it was not. She said she was telling the truth now because it was the only thing she still had to trade, and she said it without wrapping it in remorse, which Sloane respected more than the alternative would have allowed. Sloane called her attorney and began the process of establishing a formal cooperation agreement, not forgiveness, not protection from consequence, but a legal framework and a witness role, and the assurance that Mallory would not be made a public instrument of Preston's exit. Evan came that afternoon and gave Sloane everything: the lease documentation, the compliance notices, the recording of Preston's offer and his threat, the camera positioning records from Blackthorne Grand, and the complete chain of title for the 3 anchor properties going back 23 years. He handed it across the table without attaching a condition, and she took it without turning the gesture into a moment larger than it needed to be. He told her the reason he had not disclosed his ownership of the relevant land parcels on the night of the introduction was that he had not known them by heart, which was true, and also that he had wanted to know whether the evening was something a person might want, rather than a negotiation wearing a personal face, which was also true, and he told her both at the same time so she could evaluate them together. She said she had suspected him because she had spent 4 years in a world where every overture had a structure underneath it. And she had stopped knowing the difference between someone standing close because they chose to, and someone standing close because she was useful. He said he understood that, and she believed him because he did not say he was different. They built the shareholder presentation together. He organized the legal and property documentation. She structured the argument and wrote the language, and the plan she was executing was hers. When Preston sent notice the following morning that the extraordinary shareholder meeting had been relocated to the 42nd floor conference suite, where the building's accessible lift had been marked under maintenance, Sloane set down the notice, allowed herself a brief, quiet smile, and said to no one in the room that Preston still believed a staircase could stop her. The merger signing was scheduled for 11 on a Thursday morning, and the 42nd floor conference suite had been arranged with the careful attention to prestige that characterized events designed to be photographed. Long table, branded materials, investment group representatives seated facing the door. Preston began his remarks at 10:45, early enough to reach the substance before anyone intending to object could arrive without explanation, and he said the company needed leadership with the capacity to stand firm under external pressure, a phrase chosen to convey the implication while remaining technically deniable, and he was mid-sentence when the door opened. Sloane came through the doorway, followed by Evan, Mallory, Malcolm Blackthorne, an independent auditor, and 2 attorneys. The accessible lift marked under maintenance had been restored to service that morning following an emergency safety inspection Evan had filed the previous afternoon. 40 minutes, no mechanical fault found, the maintenance tag placed without a corresponding work order. Preston stated that Sloane's operational authority had been suspended and her presence was irregular. Sloane placed in front of the board chair the extraordinary shareholder review request bearing signatures representing 53% of the family voting stake, and she asked that the formal reading be entered into the meeting record before any signing occurred. The board chair confirmed it was procedurally valid. Sloane presented in sequence. The renovation invoices cross-referenced against the actual condition of the accessible systems she and Evan had physically documented. The wire transfers to Voss Strategic Advisory, with the registered address overlap connecting Mallory's entity to Preston's approvals. The email instructing Dana Whitlock on the entrance arrangement, with the production company billing receipt for the camera. The login data showing Sloane's credentials had been accessed from a device associated with Preston's personal technology vendor, and the audio recording of Preston's conversation with Evan, in which he described the strategy of isolating Sloane as too emotionally compromised to retain her position, and in which he issued a threat against a minor child. Malcolm Blackthorne confirmed that his hotel had been approached by the Kingsley corporate communications team and compensated for its role in managing the guest situation. Mallory stood and gave her account without notes and without softening the edges of it, and the room received it in the silence of people shown something they had been choosing not to see. Evan presented the ground lease documentation for all 3 anchor properties and stated formally that the renewal agreements would not be executed under any transaction structure incorporating the fraudulently represented asset valuations his team had identified in the merger due diligence package. The investment group's lead representative asked one quiet question of his legal advisor, and then closed his folder with the decisive gesture of someone ending a conversation rather than pausing it. Preston pushed back from the table and said that Evan was a single father from a construction background who had involved himself in a family matter for financial gain, and that the board should ask what precedent was being set by allowing an outside property manager to determine the outcome of a century-old enterprise. He said it with the confidence of someone who had used that construction before and found it effective. Evan passed the chain of title documents to the investment group's attorney without speaking, because the documents said what needed to be said. The attorney confirmed that the assets as represented were subject to ground lease conditions not disclosed in the merger materials. The investment group formally suspended the transaction. Preston's acting CEO designation was withdrawn by the board chair before the room finished processing what had happened. He turned to Sloane as the room cleared and said, in a voice that had finally run out of its professional register, that there were ways to handle this that did not require destroying everything their grandfather had built, and he was asking her as family to let the process conclude quietly. The reversal was complete. The man who had stood in a boardroom and described her as a weight the company could no longer carry was asking her to carry him. Sloane looked at him with the patience that comes from having nothing left to prove, and she said that a family's reputation could not be protected by asking the people it had harmed to absorb the cost of that protection. Preston was escorted from the 42nd floor by building security in full view of the journalist who had arrived expecting a different ceremony. The board voted to restore Sloane's CEO authority under conditions she had drafted herself: the removal of unqualified family members from advisory positions, an independent audit committee, and full public disclosure of the renovation discrepancy findings. Dana Whitlock was dismissed from Blackthorn Grand that afternoon, and Malcolm signed a remediation agreement for his property's accessible infrastructure as a condition of any future lease conversation. Before the press was admitted, a journalist asked Sloane whether she wanted to acknowledge Evan's role in the outcome. She looked at the room, the empty chair where Preston had sat, the board members who had voted against her now arranging their expressions into shapes of support, and said, clearly enough for the record, that Evan had opened a door, and that she was the one who had walked through it, and that she was the one who had won back her company. Evan was standing near the window and smiled at the table in front of him, because that was exactly the thing he had wanted to be true. 6 months after the extraordinary shareholder meeting, Kingsley Crown Hotels completed the first phase of a comprehensive internal audit that replaced self-reported compliance systems with third-party verification for every property in the portfolio. All 18 hotels were physically inspected, every accessible room tested against the standard rather than the specification, every accessible route confirmed before it was logged as functional. The renovation but Preston had redirected was recovered through the civil proceedings that followed his removal, and the recovery funded the actual improvements. Sloane issued a quarterly operations update in the same format she used for financial results, and the completeness of it was its own statement. Rourke Urban Holdings competed in the open tender for the structural upgrade contract on 4 properties and won on the merits of its technical documentation. Malcolm Blackthorn oversaw the renovation of his hotel's main entrance in person, replacing the planters that had blocked the entrance sensor with an open stone threshold that accommodated any configuration of guest approach without requiring redirection. Mallory Voss cooperated fully with the proceedings and began building a professional life on a foundation she had chosen. Preston faced civil litigation and a continuing financial investigation, and the story resolved, as such stories tend to, into documents rather than scenes. 6 months after the shareholder meeting, Evan reserved a table at the Blackthorn Grand Garden Terrace. the same glass-enclosed corridor where they had finished their first evening. He arrived without a work jacket. He had confirmed the table's configuration with the venue 3 days in advance, the way he confirmed structural tolerances before signing off on a build, and when Sloane arrived, the space was simply ready. No production, no demonstration, no armchair in the wrong position. She saw the empty space beside the table where a chair would have been, and she recognized that it had been removed before she arrived rather than moved when she got there. And the distinction was small and exact, and she let herself feel the precision of it. She sat across from him and looked at the city through the glass walls, and after a moment she said it the way she had said it the first time, the words carrying the weight of the months between them. "Sorry, I'm in a wheelchair." Evan looked at the empty space beside the table and said, without hesitation and without ceremony, that it was still not something she needed to apologize for, and that it never had been. They ordered, without consulting the occasion, and talked the way people talk when they have already said the significant things and are now finding out what is underneath them. He told her that the years he had spent being quiet about who he was had been, in the most honest reading, a form of protection he had applied to a self he had stopped letting people see after his wife died, and that she had shown him the cost of that kind of privacy by showing him what it cost her to move through a world that required her to justify her presence before being admitted. She said she had spent 4 years perfecting the preemptive apology, the voluntary diminishment, the way of entering a room at a disadvantage so she could not be surprised by one, and that she was done with it, and she said it as a statement of fact rather than a declaration. He told her formally, the same way he tendered a project proposal, with the appropriate context in order, that he would like her to meet Avery. She said yes. Avery appeared briefly at the end of the evening, brought by a friend who was dropping her nearby, and she shook Sloane's hand with the particular seriousness of a teenager who had been told this was important and had decided to believe it, and said it was nice to meet you in a way that meant she had already formed a view and it was not unfavorable. She left after 8 minutes. The evening did not require her to stay longer. The Open Door Initiative, a fund for independent accessibility auditing of hotels and public facilities, was incorporated 2 months later under a name that carried neither of their identities. It operated as a professional service organization staffed by architects and compliance specialists, and the first property it assessed was not a Kingsley hotel, but a mid-size convention center in a city neither of them lived in, chosen because it had generated the most unresolved accessibility complaints in the preceding year. Sloane and Evan built a life together the way two people build in a space they intend to inhabit, not all at once, and not without measuring the load-bearing elements first, with the understanding that the structure needed to hold what it was actually holding rather than what it had been described as holding. He did not become her resolution. She did not become his proof of anything. They chose to enter each other's lives as equals, and the space between them was wide enough from the beginning because one of them had always known how to build for access, and the other had finally stopped apologizing for needing it. Months before, Sloane Kingsley had walked into a staged evening and said sorry for the chair she was sitting in. 6 months later, she walked through the front entrance of her own company, the main door, unobstructed, unannounced, without a word of explanation to anyone, without lowering her head to any room, and without saying sorry to a single person for the life she had built and intended to keep.